Mm. Hey, what's up, y'all? Lupe here. With another edition of Super Facts. Some early morning Super Facts. Kind of sad Super Facts. Want to talk about slavery, human trafficking, etc. In light of this Libyan slave trade situation. Just so we can all be on the same page, or at least attempt to get on the same page. I didn't want to say anything earlier, like when the reports first start coming out, because I feel like I didn't have all the information, and then sometimes people tend to overreact or misreport. So my rule of thumb is to just kind of let things kind of play out, to see what's really what really is the issue, as opposed to just kind of piggybacking memes and pictures and stuff like that. You gotta be careful these days, especially with so much misinformation and disinformation and fake news. Shout out to DT. So what is this Libyan slave trade situation, and kind of what is the impetus for it, and how did it come to be? One of the sad parts, and most people don't want to believe this, especially black folk. But it's an interesting kind of plot twist. There's been slavery in one form or another in Africa for a long time. There's been slavery in the world, just in different places for the longest of time. There's always been slave labor, free labor, however you want to title it, chattel slavery, fiefdoms, where people were basically rendered serfs. You come to America post-slavery, you had things like apprenticeship programs, even in a lot of places in the post-slavery, South America and Central America, Mexico, and even in the U.S., you had things where people transferred from slavery, out and out, just straight slavery, into things like apprenticeship programs and very weird, ambiguous work relationships where people were basically tied to the land. Certain slaves were forced to pay rent, so they would pay them, but they would turn around and for them to stay on the land because they had nowhere to go. They were born and raised on these plantations. They would the plantation owners would emancipate them, but then would turn around and charge them rent to stay on the land, and the rent just so happened to be the same amount that they got paid. So there's all these various institutions of how people retained labor and unfair labor practices all over the world. Just comes in different names, different forms. Sometimes about force, sometimes about isolation. From what I can tell, in different parts of Africa, it still goes on. Because there's this pre-existing history, there is a racial and religious context to it as well. When you bring in the Arabs who came into Africa to trade and do different things, and even if you go to certain parts of Africa, you'll see the Arab influence. Places like the Sudan, places along like the western coast of Africa, where there was a heavy Arab kind of colonialization hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And you started to see the Arabs intermix with the local African populations, and you started to see a trend towards Arabization people preferring the Arab lifestyle, the Arab religions, Islam, but also Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, the different flavors and formats of Islam as well, because there was a premium on being Arab, because the Arabs had like a certain status. So you had people that were straight black, black as night, but claiming to be Arab, or if they had a little piece of Arab descent in them, because the situation was that the Arab men would marry the African women, but the African men couldn't marry the Arab women. And so what you started to have was just, and they were concubines and, Arab marriages where there could be 4 wives and, all these different kind of constraints. But anyway, there's a whole mixing of Arab cultures. So even if you go Arab and African cultures, and some of y'all may not know, but like Swahili, the Swahili culture is an example of this Arab-African blend. There's even some Arabic words in the Swahili language. And, just for sources and super facts, go check out Henry Louis Gates has a documentary series called The Wonders of Africa, where he specifically goes to the Swahili land, and he goes to Nubia, and he goes to these places. I want to say it looks like it was in the early 2000s, and kind of documents all of this stuff and how the Africans are treated by the Arabs and the relationship between that. And he goes to Sudan, he goes to Egypt, and you start to see that there's things that go on in terms of the social hierarchy between the Arabs and the Africans, which is tantamount to fear and racism, but also on other parts, just to be fair, some social development and things of that nature. But there's some very interesting relationships between Arabs and Africans that's been going on in Africa for, let's call it hundreds of years, if we don't call it thousands. You have certain Africans who embrace and embody the Arab traditions because it gives them a higher status and social position. You got other folks who reject it. You got other folks who are forced out of it. Other folks who don't even know that it exists. But if you do your research today on slavery in Africa, there's still places where slavery is a hotbed. And this Libya situation seems to kind of be a new, from what I can understand, a new kind of piece in that part. And it's just to break it down for some of y'all from the understanding that I have, Africans have always been migrating north out of Africa to get to Europe. That's why you go to certain places in Europe. There's like Spain or Italy, Germany, especially France. There's large populations of Africans from all over Africa, not just northern Africa and adjacent places, but all over Africa. Just calm down, Jesus Christ. And what happens is, you pass through kind of certain countries as you go north. You pass through all the northern African states, Algeria. You pass through Egypt. You pass through Libya. Pass through Morocco, Tunisia. And it's interesting because a lot of these places were colonial kind of places. And so a lot of the nationalities there are, people speak French and people speak, it's just a colonialized area. So if it wasn't the Arabs, it was the Europeans, etc. And so anyway, Libya was Libya is one of those points just by geographic luck that people have to pass through to get to Europe, whether they're getting through legally or illegally, or whatever the process is, whether they're running from poverty, whether they're just migrating for better jobs, maybe they just really want to migrate to Europe, they may have family there, etc. The conduit from sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of Africa, takes you through Libya, because Libya is right on the coast. And then people, find a way to get, across that body of water to get into Europe. And so when you've seen a lot of the turmoil in Libya, where you had the overthrow of Gaddafi, and you had people kind of fleeing the country. They either went south, back deeper into sub-Saharan Africa, or they tried to get to Europe. And so the way I'm understanding is that there was a breakdown when Gaddafi got assassinated. And this is hearsay too, because this is something, because it's a criminal organization. It's a criminal activity when you talk about human trafficking. So it could have been something that's been going on even when Gaddafi was in power, because that migrant wave was still occurring with Gaddafi. Without Gaddafi, there would still be people trying to get from Africa into Europe, and passing through Libya, and passing through all these different states and countries to kind of get there. So this might have been something which has been around for decades, this kind of trade, and then the kind of exploitation of that, of people taking advantage of people's papers or not having papers, or charging them exorbitant fees for the ferries to get across or to guide them through. And similar to how a lot of the cartels and the different kind of criminal organizations, and even some of the legal organizations, exploit migrants all over the world, specifically here in the U.S., where they exploit the not necessarily the Mexicans, but they're in the group, but the people who are coming from places like Honduras and Guatemala, and places where the poverty and the violence is just super high. So people are trying to get north into the U.S. And so you see like these groups kind of taking advantage of people, using them to smuggle drugs, probably overcharging them for the passage, even because it's not a regulated kind of trade. So people can kind of basically charge what they want. People are under-equipped. People are, go through make it to America just to die in the desert because they don't have water. And, some captives get people out there and they leave them, or certain guides, who are in the cartel in terms of their human trafficking kind of wings, get these people up to a certain point and kind of desert them, kind of leave them on their own, take the money that they did, and people pay tens of thousands of dollars sometimes to these groups to get them across the border, or get them into Europe, maybe even sometimes more than that. And so because the system is somewhat of a criminal organization, or somewhat in the underworld, it can operate very much so with or without a Gaddafi, with or without a president, with or without a rule of law, simply because the incentive for those people is so high to get to a new life or get to a better situation, that there is going to happen anyway. And there's always opportunities for people to exploit those people who basically are in foreign lands, kind of don't know where they're going, kind of have to rely on the favors and the trust of these different folks. And I think what happens if you have somebody like Gaddafi and different dictators who they're authoritarian, yes, but they serve different roles. Part of that role is to keep an iron grip on certain things. A lot of these dictators, when they come into power, some of the first things that they do is they go after the criminal organizations, simply because maybe even to either take over those rackets, or to start to kind of tax them or charge them a fee to keep operating a racket. So there's a kind of an authoritarian regulation of that kind of business, which it's not going to be as wild as if it was unregulated. So you've seen things like that, just as a reference to kind of how the CIA wanted to control the drug cartels, or have a specific cartel in place versus another cartel in place, simply because that cartel did things in a more peaceful way or in a more peaceful manner. You see that in kind of the negotiations that take place between governments and criminal organizations, where it's like, just keep it quiet kind of a thing. So that might have been one of the roles that Gaddafi played, or whatever it was. But definitely Gaddafi leaving power, getting overthrown from power, definitely took a lot of that, if there was any type of control or any type of regulation of that trade or those groups, especially when part of a liberation of an overthrow is people go to the prisons and they let out the prison population sometimes, and that you don't know who's in that prison population. So it might have been people who were in jail for human trafficking, but because they fought against Gaddafi, were given release or some type of commutation of their sentence. and kind of went back to their old ways to exacerbate the trade. Again, that's just speculation, but just, the general framework of revolution sometimes is not as clean as we like make to perceive or believe. So anyway, somebody like Gaddafi losing power, coming out of power, opening the floodgates for exploitation of different people kind of passing through, because there were Africans in Libya, from my understanding, for a long time. It wasn't just something that is brand new, and you got to kind of check the history of why they were there, how they got there. I mean, it's Africa. But then you add in the factor of this long tradition of this kind of Arab African kind of separation in certain parts of Africa. I'm not saying in all parts of Africa, but in certain parts of Africa, there's definitely a split where there's a racism that exists between Arabs and Africans. The history of Arabs in Africa was one of slavery in some aspects or another, but there's always been kind of this weird relationship, which even as me as an African American study in Africa and studying the slave trade and being Muslim to boot, just kind of you start to see in certain places there's weird relationships, weird kind of colonial relationships, weird kind of business relationships, weird racial things, weird religious kind of pieces, and some of it is just very surreal. Listen, I'm not for everybody that's kind of going crazy. I'm just setting up the framework. I'm not saying that any of this is the absolute facts and truth on the ground. The super fact of it is just to set up the framework of Africa. That's one thing that I do know. Africa is not just one continuous place. It's very dynamic. You go from one city to the next city. It's a completely different social makeup, a completely different language. As you traverse different countries, there's completely different political breakdowns. You have democratic countries nestled up right next to authoritarian countries. And as you cross those borders, there's no man's lands where the rule of the tribes is still heavy, and there is no kind of government oversight. Part of the stability of the government is being in kind of peaceful treaties with these groups. So you take into consideration things like the Tuaregs in the Sahara, where there is no controlling the Tuaregs, so to speak. But anyway, from what I understand, there's groups of Africans who are migrating through Libya to get to Europe that are being taken advantage of by criminal organizations. And the makeup of it is, right now, it's Arab. That's from what's being reported and what's being told. It could possibly be other groups. Could possibly be just criminals coming in all shapes and sizes: Muslim, Christian, Jewish. I mean, every piece and part. There's Buddhist criminals, and where there's exploitation to be had, people will do it who have the will and the nerve to do it. And it's very disheartening, to be honest. Super disheartening to see people be exploited in that way, especially with the history of black folks and the history of slavery that we have. And if you allow yourself to just kind of be locked into a framework that slavery is a unique thing, slavery happens and occurs, human trafficking, because that's what the issue is. It's kind of like an exploitation of human trafficking, and it happens with Latinos, it happens with Asians. A large part of the kind of the criminal activity of a lot of the Asian gangs and the gang networks is human trafficking, whether it be for prostitution, cheap labor, and so there's people popping up, in semi-truck trailer tankers packed to the brim with Chinese workers who get let out into New York or let out into certain cities or go to certain places, and just kind of like get lost into this underground web of slavery. Sweatshop work and prostitution and domestic work. Say it happens to other white folks when you go into places like Russia and the Ukraine and different places where there's these criminal organizations are trafficking people to different countries for different reasons, and taking people's passports or taking their traveling papers, and kind of forcing them to work for them for free. So you see it kind of happening all over the world. And if you kind of tune into a lot of the human trafficking organizations, in terms of the people who fight it or want to bring, a certain level of attention to it, I mean, this is something that affects people of all walks of life. And it's not to do a all lives matter type situation on that. So people are like, oh, but it's black people, so it's more important. I mean, it's more important because we're black. And I'm super heated about it. But at the same time, too, if you really want to, step back and look at the wider picture of what's going on in the world today, human trafficking is a very devastating and damaging kind of thing, simply because it's exploiting people who are, looking for a better life. And that's always fucked up. People are not coming into these countries, they're really passing through these countries, and people are kind of just using that to take advantage of them and do all type of stupid shit. So, I mean, what do we do about it? How do we do it? What is the response? What is the reaction to it? I think you really have to be careful on one point, on a grand way, super fact, to be careful who the fuck you vote for. Right? In one aspect of it. I mean, we just we get so excited and just jump off into shit because it's our party, or for the symbolism of it. I mean, you got to start looking at the actions and the shit that people do, and the effects and the tertiary effects that it's going to have, even if you like those people. Hillary Clinton fucked up the world. Right? That whole shit, everybody knew that shit was bogus. Super facts. Super bogus. Right? One day, Gaddafi's at the UN, you're his friend, y'all chilling. You get this democratic wave called the Arab Spring, not the African Spring, the Arab Spring, where you have people that are just, pushing and pushing and pushing, and they weren't necessarily pushing for democracy. They wanted kind of a replacement of these kind of shitty leaders. But at the same time, too, taking into consideration that once you remove the shittiness, there's going to be consequences and repercussions. And everybody knew that Libya shit was bullshit. Right? But you still have certain factions, and this is no kind of push. It's just to express the dynamism of the situation. Like, you have a guy who parts of the world consider a bad guy. You have a guy who also a whole bunch of Africans love this guy and what he means for Africa, whether it's good or bad, and his actions in the past and his actions in the future. I mean, yeah, people do shitty shit to people, but sometimes you look at the grander picture and you say, fuck, you remove a person and then the whole country turns to shit, and is going to be shit for a long time. Right? And then when people come up to critique that particular part, the foreign policy of Obama and that whole group, people get chastised because you're critiquing one aspect of their situation. You're not critiquing the person. You're not critiquing what they do, or if they're a shitty individual. It's like, no, this one particular part seems to be like a mistake. It seems to be like bullshit. And you got Hillary Clinton happy, and we got him, he's dead, and shit like that. And then the whole country falls apart. And then a few years later, we're seeing pictures of the slave trade like we're watching fucking Amistad. And to the Arab folks out there and my fellow Muslims, like, we don't fuck with this. Black folks ain't fucking with this one. This ain't cool at all. Like, that's not cool at all. And it is that, well, it's not us, but that was the same thing that white folks say today. Like, it wasn't me who enslaved such and such. But it's like you benefiting from the shit. And you say, well, I'm not benefiting from the shit personally. And it's like, well, we all need to fight this shit then. Right? Here's an opportunity that if you're not benefiting from this, but you're a part of that culture that motivates this type of thinking, that motivates this type of exploitation. Because it's really racist. I mean, a lot of that shit in Arab culture and Muslim culture is fucking racist. You know, I've had Arab dudes pat me on my head like I was a fucking dog and say salam alaikum. That shit is fucking crazy. And I think this is just a representation of that flashpoint. So to take this to have a larger conversation, because how do we deal with the Libya situation? I mean, there's going to be some law enforcement. There's going to have to be some, you know, the global community is going to have to kind of get together and go in there and figure that shit out. A lot of those militias and those kind of proxy governments that are kind of running around the chaos of Libya are going to have to, you know, there's going to have to be some diplomacy and some fucking incentive for them to kind of clamp down on the criminal elements that are operating in their territories, at least in this one issue, right? Because the what it will do is it will take this sense of like this disgust and hatred that is building and anger that is building as black people all around the world look at this situation, and it's going to heighten this divide between Arabs and black people. And the greater good of it is to say, you know, how can we bring this shit together, right? And not just in one particular region. I'm saying just in general, the general narrative. And you don't want that narrative, right? I mean, the history supports it. When you look back at the Arab relationships in Africa, you'll see like, oh shit, it's fucked up, right? Now you're looking forward to the future and say, oh, it's still kind of fucked up. I mean, that's not the type of narrative that I think anybody wants to have. But I feel like that's where it's going. So what can you do as an individual citizen? I mean, support and speak out, but also try and figure out ways to support and affect human trafficking in your area, because it's something that you might not be able to do in Libya, in Africa. You might not have any type of fucking way to help the situation that's going on in Libya right now. You're just probably too far from it. You'll probably make it worse doing some dumb shit. But one thing that you can kind of help and control is in your area, you know, to either shed light on certain things or to support or join groups that are helping to, if not stop the traffic, to at least help the people that are caught up in it, you know, or the people who came out of it, you know, help them try and achieve the goals that they wanted to do in life, if you're able to, if you care to that point. Why they even got themselves caught up in that situation, trying to migrate from one point to another for those particular group of people that were kidnapped and exploited. I mean, ain't shit you can really do about that. But the people that are like, you know, trying to live a certain lifestyle or escaping some type of poverty or some type of violence, and you know that kind of exists in where you are, you know, fight for those folks on behalf of the folks in Libya that are going through what they're going through, and on behalf of folks all around the world, in every country in the world where there's human trafficking and human exploitation. You know, fight for the people that you can, even if it's just one person. You know, you don't have to be Superman and try to save the whole fucking world. But if you really feel impacted and affected by this, whether you're a celebrity or you're a private citizen or you're a fucking nobody, that's one thing that you can kind of do. Is to figure out what's the situation with human trafficking locally where you are, and then how can you affect some type of change in that sense, and do it on behalf of the people that are everywhere else. For you people that are able to kind of do something in Libya, like maybe you have family members or something like that are there, or you know, you're a Libyan citizen, or you're a citizen of the countries that surround Libya. I mean, Libya still has to trade. I mean, they still selling oil. They still kind of have to, you know, relate to the rest of the world and, you know, apply some pressure, you know, to those folks. You feel me? Listen, I hear what you're saying. What was this Robaz 702? I hear what you're saying, but one thing you have to take into consideration, Miss Robaz, is that whether you want the news to report it or not, whether you believe that the news is skewing it or not skewing it, I mean, it's happening. I take all the pictures with a grain of salt because I feel like there's certain pictures which are kind of be layered in, and there are black people who fought in the different militias with Gaddafi and were kind of ostracized, and you have to take that in consideration, that this is a reprisal from certain groups, because Libya is a big fucking country with groups all over the country fighting, and there were black militiamen, there were blacks who were brought in from sub-Saharan Africa to fight for Gaddafi, and when Gaddafi fell, there was reprisals against those groups, and this could be a reverberation of that happening, right? And so some of the shit that we're seeing might be people trying to exacerbate the situation, similar to the Centoya case. Well, when you see the picture, that picture is like from fucking 2007, right? I mean, she's not 14 now. I mean, it happened when she was 14 or 16, but it didn't happen. She's older now, but the picture that they're showing is this young girl because it's for the effect, right? So, I mean, yeah, could the same thing be happening with the pictures and the footage that's coming out of Libya? Might we be seeing people using horrific photos? Because for the most part, you're not going to really see human trafficking like that. Like, they're not going to have that shit on display like that. So when you see somebody with a gun to their head, you might not be seeing a kidnapping taking place or evidence of some type of group selling people, especially when they're not going to do it in military uniforms and fatigues, because you're marking yourself, and especially if you're trying to do business with the U.S., they're not going to fucking do business with you. I don't care how much oil you got. So take that into consideration, that some of the photos that we might be seeing are relevant, but they might not be relevant specifically to this case. And so I'm not just taking it as a super, like, I see these pictures and then it's like, oh man, I'm so angry because the dude's got a gun in his head. But if that's a photo of a militia rounding up kind of prisoners or people sympathizers for Gaddafi, then it makes sense, right? But it's happening, right? But still, the news is the news. They're going to tell a story the way they want to tell it. But it's something that we have to deal with now. And so how do we navigate that space? Be very vigilant about what you read. If you can fact check. For you people that have the ability to have people on the ground, whether they be Libyans or they be African immigrants, research those stories, try and find some type of truth in it. Try and, whittle down the bullshit from what's really happening. Is it really as widespread as it may be seen to be, because it may not be. And, it's not a time to kind of overreact, but it is a time to address the issue, because human trafficking is real, whether you want to believe it or not. I mean, the statistics and the stories and the footage is real, right? So, before we all fly off the handle about things, again, shit got me fucked up. To reiterate, the grander position is that is what I see happening is there's starting to become a divide between Arabs and blacks because of this issue. Whether this issue is fully realized or fully not, I think it's time that if for Arabs and blacks to kind of have a real serious conversation, not to be pushed apart by this story, the reality of the story, and then kind of some of the fudgy details, which I take with a grain of salt. But even with that said, the conversation is here, the history is there, and I think it's time for at least if you live in a community where there's a relationship, if you're Muslim and you go to a mosque and there's Arabs and there's blacks, I think go to your imam and ask the imam for the khutbah next Friday, and Jummah, or for the next kind of meeting or something like that, to kind of address this I am Muslim, and I'm not a Zionist. I just Robot's girl is really funky. I am Muslim. I was born Muslim. And I have friends from all over the world who are Muslim. And I've received some racist treatment by some other Muslims, right? Younger kids, young dudes, but it was still just kind of fucked up. As well as Indian Muslims, treated me like I was like the entertainment, which was kind of fucked up. But if you're locally in your mosque for Muslims specifically, and for African American Muslims or Black Muslims or folks from Africa, if you go to a mosque and there's a blend of Arabs and Africans or Arabs and Blacks, kind of maybe make a push for your imam to make this the subject of the next khutbah. So you can address this, and not to create a division, but to hopefully kind of stymie some of the divisions that I feel is happening in general. Because now you have a lot of Black African Americans who are bringing up Islam, and bringing up Arabs and bringing up this other thing, and it's not everybody. And so just want to make sure that conversation doesn't get too far out of hand, and exacerbates a lot of the history and pre-existing conditions and some of the bad shit that exists between Arabs and Blacks in communities all over the world. So, do what you can. Alright? I guess that's it. I'm not even gonna try and promote no concerts on here, simply because it's so like such a fucked up thing. But if you're interested in this story, if you're interested in what's happening in Libya, you want to do something about it, do some research on human trafficking awareness groups or NGOs that are helping to kind of fight or bring light to the issues of people who are currently going into human trafficking. And some of the things, how can you resolve some of the issues so people don't want to migrate, to alleviate some of the effects of the countries and the cities that they're coming from, where they feel or they're forced to leave due to violence or poverty or what have you. People leave and migrate for various reasons. Most of it is poverty or violence, or ethnic tensions or something like that. So if you can kind of preempt or help to preempt those situations from even happening, you can also do that as well. Again, the realization is you may not be able to do anything to affect something that's happening in Libya right now, but you can maybe help the next situation from occurring, and also you can help the people who are coming out of situations of exploitation, as they who've kind of went through that process and are on the other side, who's still in need of some type of help, or even if it's just putting together, organizing a group of people to educate you on that subject, and people who've kind of went through that process and went through human trafficking, whether it be prostitution or it be forced labor or some type of other kind of ransom style kidnapping, holding your paperwork for hostage kind of situation. If there's people like that exist in your community, maybe bring them together to kind of have a fireside chat about their experiences and what were their motivations, and then what happened to them in the process. So you can just have a better understanding on a person-to-person level about how that works. What is it actually? So you're not just kind of flying off the handle, paying your attention or your assets or your monies to groups who are focused on a problem which isn't really affecting the problem that you want to kind of fix. So that's it. Yeah. All right. Appreciate y'all. Have a good day in light of all of this, and I'm gonna leave this up. And I know somebody's going to kind of rip it and throw it up on YouTube, and that's fine. But, yeah, peace and much love to you. All right?